Representative Freeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my wonderful seatmate, because we just had a conversation before you all sat down at the table. And thanks for being there. My question that is similar to hers, and I'm really concerned about the cut to the domestic violence centers, and I think the cut was $7 million total. How that splits out and where it came from, I don't recall the details there. But what can you speak to that? Is there anything we can do because if we're really committed as a legislative and an executive branch together to addressing crime, as much as mental health and addiction, domestic violence sits right in there. And I'm one who has a family member who was killed because of domestic violence in 2020 in Youngsville, Louisiana, my first cousin. So not that it wasn't important before that Lori was murdered by her abuser, but it is very important if we are really going to address mental health and maternal mortality and addiction, that we find a way to put that $7 million back. That's my question. What are your suggestions to us? Because I would hope that my colleagues would help me find that $7 million.
Sure, and thank you for sharing that, Representative Freeman. So we, the $7 million was added last year by the legislature. So as a legislative instrument, $7 million last year. So that's non-recurred in this proposed budget. There was an additional amount of funding on top of that seven, right? So I think we've averaged about $8 million of funding for domestic violence across a combination of funding streams. Some state general funds, some TANF funds, some stat dead fund, and some self-generated, I think, family violence fund. I probably messed that up. But it's like a combination of things. So that $7 million, while that's not there, there is continued funding, and we've been working with the coalition. That's going to continue. I mean, we had some questions about that. You may have seen that in the media about, is DCFS cutting funding. We have no intention of reducing the other funding that we were providing. So the 7 is not in the budget. So that would need to be added.
But it was in the budget for the 24, the current budget.
Correct. Yeah, it was added as a one-time. My understanding is it was added as a one-time funding to begin some of the expansion of the shelters. The understanding of whether it was one time or the communication of whether it was one time, I don't know if that got mixed up with prior leaders. The result of it is that it's not in the proposal right now. So that would need to be essentially added by the legislature.
Okay, and I don't know either what the one time, whether that was communicated in that way or not. I don't recall. But what I will say is that $7 million means a certain number of people, and I don't know the number. So I'm thinking about the victims of domestic violence who need that bed space for themselves or their family members. So whatever part I can be in part of a conversation to restore that. I mean, I'd hope that the governor and all my colleagues would see that when we don't fund that, we end up with more criminal justice problems, more mental health issues, children who are in foster care, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a terrible spiral for any family in the state to be part of. So that was my question on domestic violence.
And Representative Freeman have already touched on the domestic violence issue that I'm also concerned about. I'm a victim of domestic violence, so any funding that's reduced in that area seriously concerns me. So I'd like to have some additional conversations with y'all, maybe a sidebar, to see how do we restore the funding to domestic violence. We ranked very high in domestic violence cases. I actually offered legislation to create a domestic violence court in EBR to address some of these issues. So I don't want to see us take a step backwards. And when we take funding away from a much-needed program, I don't want to see an increase in domestic violence because of the lack of funding for the programs that we really need to address. So thank Representative Freeman for bringing that up.
Representative Owens. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all very much for being here today. My question is budget related, but it's kind of construct related too. I have some curiosity about how you manage your budget in the context of domestic violence shelters. Do we have enough of those around the state? I know we've been talking about domestic violence. I'm very ignorant on this, but I'm very concerned about this because although Louisiana is a small state, there's a long way between some of our towns. Mm-hmm. And for people who live in the country, when you have someone who needs shelter and they say, oh, you live in Manny, we'll just drive to Shreveport. Or you live in DeRidder, we'll just drive to Lake Charles. Life doesn't really work that way. And I'm just curious if y'all have a macro level game plan for that, or if that's something that's on your radar scope, because very, very concerned about shelters.
So I don't think I can answer that question. I think that we, through the work that we've been doing to determine what's funded, what's not funded, I think that is a question for some of our partners. So we contract, essentially with local organizations. So that's something that I think we can pull together. I mean, we talked about it here. We're going to be looking at this. I think we can get some of that information together and educate you on that and bring it back to this committee.
A couple of things. I'm David Matlock, Mr. Chairman. Very nice to meet you. I was with a group of foster parents, and the main thing's keeping the main thing. It is no deprivation or of the importance of this committee. Y'all are fundamentally, foundationally important to the state of Louisiana, to the mission of the Department of Children and Family Services. Foster parents are very, very important as well. Interestingly, the Shreveport shelter is run by the folks from Manny.
Okay.
And they do a great job. But it's a law enforcement issue because the line officers, the police officers, the sheriffs, deputies, they're the ones that have to deal with that situation and be able to tell this family where they can go to get shelter or safety from a domestic violence situation. And so geographic location is a big deal. It permeates services. It permeates mental health services, substance abuse recovery services, many other SNAP benefits, and so forth. You have to, and driver's licenses. We live in a virtual world, but warm handoffs and warm contact is where a lot of the service has to be delivered, and certainly in that area. So we are supportive of that. We also want to keep the main thing and be able to allocate our resources in a solid way to protect children. We've got three fundamental missions. One is to protect children from abuse and neglect and abandonment by their caretakers, by their parents. Mission number two is to help individuals and families become self-sufficient. Mission number three is to provide shelter in mass emergencies. Those are our three principal missions. And if we're not allocating resources to take care of those things, then we have to take a hard look at ourselves. And we are trying to reallocate our services to line-level programming to be able to get services to line workers in all of those areas, all three of those areas that I mentioned. And domestic violence is an issue, and we want to be a good partner with the outside agencies, non-governmental organizations, with the legislature to address those issues. But, we all need to recognize proximity is existential for some folks when it comes to those issues. And I appreciate your interest.
Well, thank you.
And I was born the first 2 years of my life in Manny. So that's where I get this wonderful sort of sophisticated Eastern-sounding voice inflection.
Well, thank you all. I will certainly stay in touch on this. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Members, what I did was I asked staff, because I've had multiple emails on the domestic violence money. So I had staff go back and pull the budget from last year, HB1. That $7 million was added in the Senate in an amendment in committee, in finance. And the purpose of that was, and this is a specific in the budget, one-time funding for non-reoccurring special legislative projects. So that $7 million purpose was not for reoccurring dollars for administration, although I agree we need to look at that. It was for specifically to build more shelters. So I didn't know that, you didn't know that, but this is what I've had staff working on since that conversation has come up by multiple members. And I know that domestic violence advocates will be here for public testimony, but I want that to be on our minds as we hear this. And look, and it's not just with this $7 million that we're hearing this. This is from multiple agencies that we're hearing about all that one-time money that I want to remind everybody that was so significant last year. And unfortunately, we did so many great things with that much money, but it was not reoccurring. It was one-time surplus excess dollars that we may not ever see again in that large amount of capacity. And the intent was to do specific items. But we all agree in here, and I believe that DCFS would agree, that we need to do a better job of providing a place, a shelter for women and children. And I guess there are possibilities of men and children. It's pretty rough women, too. For an opportunity for everyone to have a place of safety when they're in a bad environment. Don't look at me, Miss Butler. Rough women. But
I would like us to be fact oriented when we do that. What are the real needs? Where can those shelters best be provided, and how much is really needed? The one-time money, but that one-time money always leads to maybe a reduced, but a sustaining issue to help that. And so we just want to be a good partner. Some of those decisions are really over our pay grade, to be honest with you. But we want to be a solid partner for y'all and provide any information that we can provide to y'all that will be helpful for y'all to make good decisions.